Welcome, everyone. I am Priyamvada Natarajan. I'm an astrophysicist and the current director of the Franke program in Science and the Humanities at Yale, which is our flagship interdisciplinary program. So I'm delighted to see you all in the audience today, gathered for a wonderful event this evening. We have a treat in store, a book talk by one of our very own distinguished faculty members, Carlos Ayer. Okay, on to this evening's event. Carlos Ayer is the Lawson Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies, and he received his PhD from Yale in 1979, and he specializes in the social, intellectual, religious, and cultural history of the late medieval and early modern Europe, with a focus on both the Protestant and Catholic Reformations, the history of the supernatural, which is, of course, what really fascinated both Dr. Camp, who, as you all know, without whom this event would not have happened. We are both fangirls of his work on the history of the supernatural and the history of death. Before joining the Yale faculty in 1996, he taught at St. John's University in Minnesota, the University of Virginia, and was a member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton for 2 years. He's the author of multiple books, including The War Against the Idols, The Reformation of Worship from Erasmus to Calvin, From Madrid to Purgatory, The Art and Craft of Dying in 16th Century Spain, A Very Brief History of Eternity, which I love the title. I have not read that book, should get that one. Reformations, The Early Modern World, The Life of Saint Teresa of Avila, biography, and They Flew, A History of the Impossible, which is what we're going to be hearing about today, the subject of today's talk. He's also the co-author of Jews, Christians, Muslims, An Introduction to Monotheistic Religions, and has also ventured into later time span in history to the 20th century and the Cuban Revolution in the memoir Waiting for Snow in Havana, which was published in 2003, and it won the National Book Award for nonfiction in the United States and has been translated into more than a dozen languages. His second memoir, Learning to Die in Miami, explores the exile experience of being in this country. A past president of the Society for Reformation Research, he is currently working on several topics in the history of the supernatural. His book Reformations also won many prizes, including the R.R. Hawkins Prize for the Best Book of the Year from the American Publishers Association and the award for the Best Book in the Humanities in 2017. Was also awarded the Yaroslav Pelikan Prize by Yale University Press. So, interestingly, all of his books are banned in Cuba. You know what that means. You are immediately a celebrity once you have a banned book. It's almost better than having a stalker, which is supposed to be like the first mark of, having arrived at celebritydom, where he has been proclaimed an enemy of the state. That actually sounds scarier than just having your books banned. A distinction that he regards as the highest of all his honors. So hopefully in the Q&A we can ask him a little bit more about that. So I just want to give you a brief notice of upcoming exciting events. We are hosting a conference on the nature of inference for those of you who've been attending the Understanding the Nature of Inference series. Our conference is on the 14th and 15th of December at the Greenberg Conference Center at Yale. And if you would like to attend, please go to the website and register. And in spring 2024, we have a ton of exciting events, preview of coming attractions. We have Dr. Meredith Broussard, who's investigating the ways in which big data and technology are reinforcing race and gender inequality in our society. Will be giving us a talk. We have a screening of Richland, a new documentary on a small town struggling with its identity as a center of weapon-grade plutonium production. And then we have Christian Cooper on April 4th. He was the victim of the Central Park birdwatching incident, for those of you who may remember. So we have a lot of events coming up in the spring. And now I want to, without further ado, invite Carlos to come and speak to us. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you. And thanks to everyone responsible for making this happen. And thank you all for being here on a cold, it's almost December afternoon. Is a history of the impossible possible? History of the Impossible is the subtitle of my book for a reason. And this lecture will focus on this issue of how any objective historian can write a history of things that almost everyone, if not everyone, thinks cannot happen and have not ever happened. So, moving on, how can one write a history of the impossible? I chose two impossible miracles that most people would agree are not only impossible, but as an audience member has already suggested to me, you're not doing the history of the impossible, you're doing the history of the ridiculous. Or as a review that appeared in the Spectator UK website last week accused me of sliding into silliness. I chose two impossible miracles: levitation and bilocation. Oh, scary stuff. For all scholars, historians or non-historians alike, there can be a war between the facts. First fact, before I get into Troeltsch and James, there is no denying the fact that we have testimonies of levitating and bilocating human beings. That is a fact, and it's a fact that can't be denied. We have testimonies. But what kind of fact can one deal with when one deals with the impossible? Well, Ernst Troeltsch, social scientist, came up with a very useful concept many, many, many years ago: the social fact. What is a social fact? Let me explain before I get to the fine points. Social fact is an idea or a concept or a set of beliefs that are widely held, and perhaps so widely held and perhaps even defended or demands certain kinds of behavior that one cannot simply go against them. We all live with social facts. And for instance, in our own day and age, it is a social fact that some words have become verboten. There are certain words you cannot say in public unless you like being pilloried. That's a social fact, and we live with it. Levitation and bilocation, also social facts throughout history and in some parts of the world. And as I used to, when I used to consult with my colleagues who do Asian religions, and I told them what my project was, they were not in the least bit impressed. Levitation, bilocation. So what? Yeah, of course. Of course. You know, it's a social fact in much of older Asian religion. Social fact. But there are anomalous events, let's call them miracles, which cannot ever be ascribed to supernatural causes. That's our social fact that we live with. These anomalous events cannot or should not be ascribed to supernatural causes. And it is a social fact, accepted, very widely accepted, that humans cannot defy gravity without technology, and also that humans cannot be present in two places simultaneously. These are social facts widely accepted in our own day and age. But then there are also wild facts. One of my favorite terms from William James, brother of Henry James. What is a wild fact? It's an anomalous event that just doesn't fit any pigeonhole. It's actually like the proverbial square peg that cannot go into the round hole. Some anomalous events, let's call them wild facts, defy explanation. And these are our wild facts when it comes to the two miracles I have examined. We have thousands of reports of humans hovering and flying. And we have thousands of reports of humans being in two places simultaneously. But before I go any further, the accepted way of approaching any of these wild facts for a historian is to place brackets around the phenomenon itself. The event can be studied, the testimonies can be studied, but the proper thing to do is to take either a functionalist or structuralist approach to the event and analyze what meaning and purpose belief in this event has for the people who are testifying that they witnessed it. So you have to bring your brackets to the phenomenon. I am trying to question the brackets or their necessity. But down to brass tacks, what is a miracle in the Christian tradition, which is the only tradition I'm focusing on in my book? St. Augustine of Hippo was challenged by a Manichaean named Faustus, who argued that Christian miracles were contrary to nature and therefore false, impossible. Augustine replied by saying that there is, and I quote, "There is no impropriety in saying that God does something against nature when it is contrary to what we know of nature. For we give the name nature to the usual and known course of nature, and whatever God does contrary to this we call prodigies or miracles." So the focus is on whatever knowledge one has of nature, not what the laws of nature accepted in one's day and time might be. Aquinas, in the 13th century, had this definition of miracle in Summa Contra Gentiles: a miracle is a sensible effect produced by God which transcends all the forces of nature, with emphasis on transcends. And a miracle, Aquinas argued, does not contradict, destroy, antagonize, or violate the forces of nature. It is an effect which exceeds all the inherent powers of the forces of nature. It is something that happens as an exception to the regular working of the established order. And God, who made the forces of nature, can cause something to happen at his will, which gives evidence of his dominion over these forces. But along comes the Protestant Reformation in 1517. Can be dated exactly to October 31st, 1517. Here's Martin Luther on miracles. Those visible works are simply signs for the ignorant, unbelieving crowd, and for their sakes that are yet to be attracted. But as for us who know already all we do know and believe the gospel, what do we want them for? Main point: Luther and all the other major first and second generation Protestant reformers rejected the existence of any miracles post the year 100. I'll get to that in a couple of minutes, why they thought this was so. Second generation reformer John Calvin on miracles, and this is key. We may also fitly remember that Satan has his miracles, which, though they are deceitful tricks rather than true powers, are such a sort as to mislead the simple-minded and untutored. Look at that condescension. Idolatry has been nourished by wonderful miracles, yet these are not sufficient to sanction the superstition either of magicians or idolaters. Harsh words, Calvin. Of course, Protestant Reformation was all about returning to the Bible alone. So, what about all those miracles in the Bible? And, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is full of miracles. My God, crossing the Red Sea. And many, many, many others. And the New Testament is full of miracles, too. There's Christ healing the blind man, Renaissance period painting. But it's not just the Gospels that are full of miracles. The Acts of the Apostles also relates that the apostles themselves, after Jesus' resurrection and ascension, performed all sorts of miracles, and not just healing miracles, but wondrous miracles, such as St. Paul being bitten by a venomous snake and surviving totally unharmed. What to do? What to do? There are miracles in the Bible. Why can't there be any miracles now? But before I go any further with slides, there is this very significant tactical, polemical issue that all the first and second generation Protestant reformers had to face. Their Catholic opponents were constantly asking, where are your miracles? Right? We have a long history of miracles, and we have all these miracles. Where are your miracles? Your church must be false. So, solution. Miracles stopped at the year 100. It's known in Protestant theology as the cessation of miracles argument. That this doctrine affirms that the miracles described in the Bible ceased at the end of the apostolic age, around the year 100. And why 100? Well, that was the accepted date, more or less, for the death of the last of the 12 apostles, the Apostle John. Jesus had commissioned the apostles, because in the Gospels there is blatantly stated that he gives them power to do all these miraculous things. But there's nothing else in the New Testament that says that this had a expiration code stamped on it. The argument ran like this for the cessation of miracles. Miracles were necessary to convince people that Jesus was indeed the Son of God. Once the first and second and perhaps even third generation of converts were won over to belief in Jesus as the Messiah and the Son of God, miracles were no longer necessary. Because the greatest miracle of all about Christianity was the fact that more people kept converting without miracles. That was the greatest miracle of all. And here's a book from 1917 by Benjamin Warfield, Counterfeit Miracles, which was all about the cessation of miracles argument, because in later Protestantism, the cessation of miracles doctrine came under attack. Now, Warfield here is defending, still in 1917, the cessation of miracles argument. And there's a long text from John Calvin. I won't read all of it, but this is the important passage. The gift of healing was temporary. All are constrained to affirm, and events clearly prove. Then he goes on to say, anyone, the rest of the statement basically says, that anyone who is claiming a miracle past the apostolic age is aping, that's the verb, aping the apostles, and simply fooling people. Then came the Enlightenment, following upon the Protestant Reformation. And for some reason, try this, Google the name of any Enlightenment philosopher and sunglasses, and you're likely to get an image like this. Voltaire, it is impossible that a being infinitely wise can have made laws to violate them. He could not derange the machine, but with a view of making it work better. But it is evident that God, all wise and omnipotent, originally made this immense machine, the universe, as good and perfect as he was able. If he saw that some imperfections would arise from the nature of matter, he provided for that in the beginning, and accordingly, he will never change anything in it. How rational, very rational, and also an echo of Faustus the Manichaean. Everyone's favorite, David Hume, Dialogue on Miracles. Miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. Ooh, Faustus the Manichaean, again. The plain consequence is, and it is a general maxim worthy of our attention, that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle. I'll pause there. We have all these testimonies, right? That's the fact we have. We have testimonies. But he says, no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle, unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. Classic Hume. A miracle supported by any human testimony is more properly a subject of derision than of argument. Hence, how does one do in a post-Humean world a history of the impossible? The Catholic Church tried to align itself against the cessation of miracles doctrine and against all Protestant arguments against Catholic miracles. Remember that line from Calvin, Satan too has his miracles? Part of the Protestant argument was that any post-apostolic age miracle claimed by the Catholic Church could only be a demonic trick rather than a miracle. Yes, Satan has his miracles. We'll return to this curious asymmetry, I call it, between Catholic and Protestant thinking on the miraculous. But this man, Prospero Lambertini, an enlightened pope, who became Pope Benedict XIV, and look at his dates, 1740 to 1758. He served, by the way, as the devil's advocate in Rome for several years. That's the person charged in canonization cases with calling into doubt everything that's being presented about the saint. So he knew exactly what was going on. There's a wonderful book titled The Rationalization of Miracle by Paolo Parigi, if you're interested in this subject. He details how it was that in the 17th century, the Catholic Church adopted a more quote-unquote scientific approach to all these testimonies about saints and their miracles. And actually, it was Pope Benedict XIV who, more than anyone else, stressed that in the canonization process, what mattered most was heroic virtue rather than miracle working. And it still, to this day, remains the primary objective in Catholic canonization process, even though you still need miracles. They're of a secondary nature. And he wrote this massive, it's a multi-volume book, De Servorum Dei Beatificatione at Beatorum Canonizationem, on the beatification of the servants of God and the canonization of the blessed, which when I first saw the title, I said, oh, I must run and read this book, until I realized how humongous it was. And that, by the way, this is still pretty much in use. Some tweaking has been done, but this is still the guidebook to this day. But, okay, Protestant Reformation, Enlightenment, then comes the secular age. And along comes the invention of social science. and this man in particular, is a very scary looking man, Max Weber, argued that the key turning point in Western history had been this Protestant cessation of miracles doctrine. That is what made the world modern. The key point was, in English translation, the disenchantment of the world. In German, it's much clearer. Entzauberung der Welt. The demagification of the world, because the German word Zauber is magic. So, along with the Protestant reformers who assigned all miracles to Satan, now Weber is pairing up, and Protestant reformers did this too, paired Catholic rituals and miracles with magic, which Christians have never thought as something good. So what kind of Entzauberung is there from the Protestant reformers? Well, there are no more sacramental miracles like the Eucharist, the bread and wine, turning into the actual physical flesh and blood of Christ. Although Luther continued to believe in the real presence, he did not believe that it could be explained. And it definitely was not the body and blood under some other guise. Other Protestant reformers went further, denying the real presence. All the miracles in the lives of the saints, such as this one depicted here by Diego Velázquez, the temptation of St. Thomas, where angels came to rescue him from a prostitute his family had placed in his room so that he would change his mind and not join the Dominican order. And if COVID does return, you can get this very nice mask, which also, if you believe in miracles, will, repel the COVID virus. And miracles within mystical visions, forget about them. Human beings do not cross the boundary into the supernatural and cannot. That was part of the Entzauberung, or disenchantment of the world. And human beings don't have visions of people in heaven like the Virgin Mary or Jesus. No, simply does not happen. Mystical ecstasy? No. And the physical phenomena or physical miracles that accompany mystical ecstasy, such as the stigmata? No. If something like this happens, for Protestant theologians, it's demonic. For enlightened humans, it's a trick. It's probably self-inflicted. So here's the tough one, levitation. And one reason I picked levitation is not only that it's so scandalously impossible, but also that the individuals that I focus on in the 16th and 17th century, the testimonies of their levitations are such that if one accepts the testimonies at face value, the levitation could not have been a trick performed with wires or ropes or any other such contraptions. But I'll pause before I forge ahead. Levitation was faked all the time, and especially in the 16th and 17th century. And we have lots of records of how these fraudsters are then processed, caught, and in many ways punished. And there's a whole section of my book that focuses on the frauds as pretty much a control in a scientific experiment. All right, you've got someone whose levitations are accepted by the Catholic Church. For every person whose levitations are accepted, you've got several whose levitations have been rejected as fraudulent. So there is this back to Prospero Lambertini and the method of rationalizing the miraculous and approaching miracles empirically. Levitation is not found in the New Testament, except for perhaps this cryptic passage from St. Paul in Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. Quote, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. It's the only kind of passage that comes close to hinting at levitation. But there are some magicians, non-Christian magicians, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century, who are going around levitating, such as Simon Magus. But Christian saints levitating, you don't find them in the early church. You begin to see them in the later Middle Ages, and the first depiction of a levitating saint that anyone knows has been painted is this one by Giotto of the Ecstasy of St. Francis, 1295. And in the Life of Francis by Bonaventure, here's the text that goes with this image. There he was beheld praying by night, his hands stretched out after the manner of a cross, his whole body uplifted from the earth and wrapped in a shining cloud, as though the wondrous illumination of the body were a witness unto the wondrous enlightenment of his mind. So he's not only levitating, he's glowing. Let's skip ahead. There are numerous levitating saints in the later Middle Ages. As a matter of fact, with each passing century, the numbers of levitating saints gets higher and higher. And we get to the 16th century. It's a response to the Protestant Reformation. Okay, you guys don't have miracles, but we do. And the number of levitating saints increases in the 16th century and 17th century. But part of this increase has a lot to do with the invention of the printing press and the publication of hagiographies, or lives of the saints. This is one reason it's much easier to find levitating saints in the early modern period than even the later centuries of the Middle Ages, is that you've got hagiographies that are printed and distributed widely. And here we have the founder of the Jesuit order, St. Ignatius Loyola, who was observed levitating and glowing. He was observed many times at night, his room filled with a bright light. He's seen raised up in the air with his knees bent, weeping, sighing, and saying, "My God, how infinitely good you are." And the Jesuit hagiographers liked this scene very much. These three images are from graphic hagiographies, a genre of hagiography that became very popular from the mid-16th century into the 17th century, where you pick up the life of the saint and it's basically like a comic book. And the text, and I left the text here so you could see how little text there is accompanying the image. So image after image after image. And notice also in these depictions, there is always a witness. The testimony is linked to the image. St. Teresa of Avila, also levitating and glowing. And this happened in front of the Bishop of Avila and a crowd of witnesses. I'll pause for a second and add something about St. Teresa that's not in the slides. St. Teresa hated to levitate and tried to resist it, and begged her nuns, actually ordered them because she was their superior, if you see me going up, hold me down. If I do go up, pull me down. And she would hold on to any object that she could as she felt it coming on, and tried to stay grounded unsuccessfully, including one time in the kitchen while she was frying eggs with the last few drops, precious drops of olive oil that her convent had left. And she goes up with a frying pan in her hand, but the nuns are under obedience, so they're trying to pull her down, but they're worried that precious oil is going to spill. But they cannot pull her down. I'll add this too. This is very common of early modern as well as medieval levitations. When does it happen? It happens during mystical ecstasy. It is a byproduct of mystical ecstasy. And it is not something that is willed. It is against your will. But more than that, you see it here, you see it in these two and other images. In mystical ecstasy, certain kinds of mystical ecstasy, the body goes into a cataleptic seizure, and that's a medical term. It becomes rigid. The senses cease to work. Whatever position you're in when you enter mystical ecstasy, you're frozen. And it's kind of humorous, but also very sad. Many of these levitating saints, their communities, prick them with needles, place lit candles right in front of their eyes, or, my favorite, blow on them because they're so nearly weightless, blow on them to watch their body waft across the room while they are in this cataleptic state. So Teresa resisted. And we don't have time for it, but she is not the only one, but the one levitator who has devoted the most page space in her writings to describing what it feels like to levitate and what it feels like to resist these levitations. And there she is levitating jointly with St. John of the Cross, one Trinity Sunday in either 1573 or 74, nobody has fixed the date, but they were discussing the Trinity, and all of a sudden, whoop, up, they both go up. And here's another depiction of this. I began this project 40 years ago, in June of 1983, when visiting the Convent of the Incarnation in Avila. Tour guide is taking us around. Here's the kitchen where Teresa cooked with her pots and pans. Here's the refectory where the nuns ate. And one of my favorites. Here's the staircase where the devil pushed Teresa down the stairs and she broke her arm. And then we get to this spot, the locutorio, where the nuns spoke with the outside world. And here's the spot where Teresa and John of the Cross levitated together for the very first time. My head exploded. It was a cognitive experience like I have never had before. There's nothing emotional about it. It's purely rational. Kant would have been very proud of me. It's a fact. To the people in this place, this is a fact. And from here on in, on and off over 40 years, until COVID hit. And then this book was written mostly during COVID. And by then, a miracle. The older a text was, printed text, the older it was, the more likely it was I would find it online. And every hagiography I needed, every single one except 2 or 3, was online for me. So I didn't need to leave the house. And from the bowels of Yale library system, if I requested a book, it would be neatly wrapped in brown paper and mailed to my doorstep. Another miracle. So, greatest levitator of all time. St. Joseph of Cupertino, 1603 to 1663. And you have here three different depictions of the same levitation. He looks more like Superman than any other character you might be familiar with. What's so special about St. Joseph? And look at the time period, 1603, 1663. The Protestant Reformation has already triumphed, taken over great chunks of Europe. So this is a century after Luther and Calvin. But from very early age, he was very pious. He would go into mystical ecstasies and levitate. But he also happened to be mentally challenged. And his nickname given to him by locals was Boca Aperta, open mouth. So the village idiot, basically, who was rejected twice first by the Franciscans and secondly the Capuchins, because he couldn't do anything right except levitate, which hindered his work. Long story short, he ends up becoming a member of the Franciscan order and being ordained a priest. His ordination was meant to be a humiliation to his superior, who was treating him like, pardon the expression, a moron. Oh, so you're treating this man this way? I'll teach you some humility. You prepare him to be a priest and you make sure he gets ordained. He managed to pass the test because the only question asked of him was on the only passage out of the entire Bible that he knew by memory, which is why he is the patron saint of test takers. Processed by the Inquisition, he passes. Why would the Inquisition process him? Well, this could be demonic, you know. Same thing with St. Teresa. Same thing with all these other early modern levitators. They had to clear away the suspicion that this might be the devil at work. And what was the best way to clear away the suspicion? Humility. Humility. These people are not trying to attract attention to themselves. They're always humble in their dealings with others. Joseph not only levitated, he flew. And he flew forwards and backwards, sometimes upside down. And here's an image of him upon seeing the shrine of the Holy House of Loreto. He goes up. And many descriptions of him going up as high as treetops. One time, he goes up to a treetop levitating and then comes out of his ecstasy in the treetop, and they have to get a very tall ladder to help him down. And this painter is unknown. This just sold at auction last year. No price disclosed, no owner disclosed. I'd like to know who has this hanging in their palace. Joseph had triggers. What triggered his ecstasies? All sorts of things. Religious imagery, especially. Hence, his flying to that cross. Sacred places, seeing the shrine of the Holy House of Loreto. And the image to the left is actually St. Joseph flying over the heads of the Spanish viceroy in Italy and his wife and their entire entourage. And his wife fainted and had to be revived with smelling salts. You see her there passed out right under Joseph. But the reason he flew over their heads is he had seen this image of the Virgin Mary and was just immediately, Mama. That's what he called her, these images, Mama. Other triggers, the sacraments, saying Mass. Most of his levitations occurred while saying Mass. And I'll return to this in a minute or two. And people in need of healing or of conversion. These two paintings blend all these triggers. On the left, you have him dragging up a young man who had lost his mind and was considered insane. He placed his hand on him to heal him and went up with him. And it's a double miracle, a levitation and a healing. The other image is St. Joseph of Cupertino saying Mass, levitating at Mass, and the person astounded is Johann Friedrich, the Lutheran Duke of Saxony, who converted to Catholicism after seeing Joseph levitate in this manner. And again, I have some pauses. This is another pause. A scientist in the UK, in Wales, got an advanced copy of my book and emailed me. He was very excited by my descriptions of St. Joseph's levitations. And the email said, basically, I'm paraphrasing, I am so happy. This proves so much about my theory of levitations being a break in time-space. And what he liked so much about Joseph is the fact that, this cataleptic posture involved not only his body, but his clothing, which retained its folds. The folds would not change. And even when upside down, the habit would not come flopping down over his head. It would stay. And when coming out of the cataleptic seizure, especially when saying Mass, Joseph, even after 3 hours, would pick up whatever spot in the missal he was at, the next word. So this scientist got all excited because, yes, he's outside of time-space. There's no time. Oh, he was so excited. I couldn't be as excited because I couldn't understand the technical terminology he was throwing at me. He went into ecstasy in solitude as well as in public, and even went over the head of Pope Urban VIII, who supposedly exclaimed, "If this man dies before I do, I will testify at his canonization inquest that he flew over my head." So talk about testimonies. This is one of the highest placed people who testified that he did, in fact, defy gravity. So in the Baroque period, 17th century mostly, you begin to see in Catholic sacred art more and more depictions of levitating saints, and especially of medieval levitating saints who had not received attention from medieval artists. So here you have a very, very odd rendition of the stigmatization of St. Francis by Vicente Carduccio, an Italian artist who Hispanicized his name from Carducci to Carduccio, who his father is also an artist who was brought to the Spanish court. And on the right, you also have another Carduccio, levitation of St. Anthony of Padua, a contemporary of St. Francis. And a levitation of St. Dominic, 13th century. And another Carduccio, vision of St. Hugo, one of the early Carthusian monks. Carduccio was a specialist, as far as I can tell. I'm not an art historian. And every colleague I've ever had in any art history department always reminds me, you are not an art historian. But Carduccio has more paintings representing levitating saints than anyone else I found. So the history, the miracle is therefore thrown to the past for display either on monastery or convent walls or church walls. And here's one of the most amazing depictions, Baroque depictions of levitation from Murillo, another Spanish artist. There are arguments still going on as to who this Franciscan friar is. Doesn't matter. He was in the kitchen. He, under his vow of obedience, he was supposed to do kitchen work, but he went into ecstasy and started levitating and glowing. So angels came to do his work, And there on the left, you see the eyewitnesses who come and find him. This painting is huge, and it hangs in the Louvre Museum. It was stolen by Napoleon's army and never returned. So add this to the list with the Elgin marbles, things that need to be returned. The other miracle is bilocation. And here's your familiar figure. Here's where we are. And there it is. You can buy that inflatable scream figure, by the way. Just Google it. Don't tell my wife. She's getting that for a Christmas present. Giotto, also bilocation by St. Francis. So again, throwing things back to the past. Greatest bilocator, not the greatest, because I found one later, but an extreme bilocator, Sor Maria de Agreda, almost the same exact dates as St. Joseph, 1602 to 1665, a Franciscan nun who bilocated repeatedly, and crossed the ocean. Never left Agreda physically, but was seen by the Jumano natives in present-day New Mexico and Texas. Visited them reportedly over 500 times to Christianize them. This is a tricky case, very tricky, but she acquired such a reputation as being a genuine bilocator that she is a legend in the American Southwest. And by sheer coincidence, one of my teaching fellows last year was traveling through San Angelo, Texas. Sent me a photo. San Angelo, Texas has erected a huge statue of the Lady in Blue, as she was known in that area, because her habit had a little bit of blue. So she crossed the ocean back and forth, and as if that were not enough, another impossible miracle I decided to not focus on too much in the book. The Virgin Mary appeared to her constantly and dictated her autobiography to this nun. And she wrote it down, was ordered to burn it. She burned it. Another superior came in and says, "Where's that Life of Mary?" "Oh, I was asked to burn it." "Oh, write it over again." It's over 1 million words long. The Mystical City of God is the English title. And guess which film relied on it heavily? Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. She describes things that are not in the New Testament. So it's an even iffier sort of impossible miracle. Because her Mystical City of God could be considered a fifth gospel. And there in this painting, you see her paired up with none other than John the Evangelist, who was also for a long time believed to be the author of the book of Revelation or the Apocalypse, with the New Jerusalem in the background. And there you see the sheer size of this work of hers, which ended up being condemned by the theological faculty of the Sorbonne, but approved by, no surprise, Salamanca, Alcalá, Louvain, which was under Spanish control, but inexplicable, Toulouse, they all approved it. Here's a fact nobody disputes. The first man to ever levitate with help in a hot air balloon. Jean-François Pilatre de Rosier, love that name, 1783. But then, to wrap up, there is the wrong kind of levitation. Witches were believed to levitate and fly. And just read the Malleus Maleficarum from the 15th century, the witchcraft treatise of all witchcraft treatises. Tells you how they fly to their Sabbaths. how they, rub oil on themselves and fly. Protestants continued to believe just about 100% of medieval Catholic demonology. But they rejected much of the theology and all of the miracles. That's the asymmetry I was referring to before. So, the peak period for flying saints is also the peak period for flying witches and witch hunts, which is why I say the 16th and 17th century is the peak period for flying humans before the invention of hot air balloons and airplanes. Levitation was possible for Protestants. The image on the left, flying witches and the devil from an English text. On the right, you see how long this idea or belief might have persisted in Spain. Here's a painting by Francisco Goya right on the edge between the 18th and 19th century. A series of paintings on witchcraft commissioned by some patron I don't know much about. And to show how perverse historians can be, or at least how perverse I am. One of the happiest days in my research of this book is when I found a Protestant demonic possession that involved levitation in Boston in 1693. A description of a young teenage girl who could not be held down or pulled down from the ceiling by several burly men, and that's how they're described, burly, who had been brought there by none other than the great Puritan minister Cotton Mather, who made them all sign affidavits testifying they had been unable to restrain the girl or pull her down. So there's symmetry, but there's asymmetry as far as the causality of these levitations. But of course, levitation can be a trick. It's done frequently, and there you can learn how to levitate. But my case is, if the descriptions are in fact truthful testimony, there's no way those levitations could have been faked. And it comes back in 19th and 20th century spiritualism. Upper left, a levitation by the great 19th century spiritualist Daniel Douglas Hume, which took place in South Manchester, Connecticut in the 1830s. And on the right, you see a Welsh spiritualist levitating. The reason everyone looks so asleep is that the photo is taken in infrared light. And the man holding the switch for the camera is none other than the levitator. So, levitation is absolutely possible. We have gadgets you can put on your desk that levitate. We have electromagnetic trains. One of my sons spent 2 years in Japan. He levitated for 2 years every time he took the electromagnetic train. And bilocation. We do it all the time. But of course, the bilocations and levitations that I've studied are of a very, very different sort. And yes, I will be constantly reminded how ridiculous and how silly the subject is. But to me, it's not silly at all. And I'm not saying I can prove that any of these things happen. What I'm saying is that historians need to adjust a little bit to supernatural events. Let's call them paranormal. Let's call them wild facts. those brackets that I was taught to wield in this very building many years ago. Don't you ever consider the supernatural real. You can't. Those brackets need shrinking, let's say. And as I argue in my book, if you want to be truly skeptical, as any good scientist should be, I could boast of being Cartesian, following Descartes. De omnibus est dubitandum. Everything ought to be doubted, including dogmatic materialism. And I'm eager to hear your questions and comments.
Thank you so much.
You want both?
Yeah, I think I'll maybe ask
Okay.
somebody else to switch it on. Okay, questions? Thank you so much. That was fascinating.
Just as a comment, I think a lot of controversy that you faced could be prevented by changing the subtitle of your book. It could be, what do we call impossible?
Right.
Because this is the crux of the matter. It's like I bought my son a book at some point by Nobel laureates, and the title was Impossible Takes Longer. And any field, I'm an experimental biologist, in any field, there are small miracles where half of the field says no, all of them say, no, it's impossible. The fire person, he goes in hiding, and then 25 years later or 50 years later, he gets a Nobel Prize because what was impossible is possible. The same thing if you gave this lecture 200 years ago, saying that you can talk to, I can talk to my son in France, it would be. So the key is, I think you somebody, San Augustine or Aquinas, you quoted, it's impossible is, we call impossible what is unexplainable to us at this stage of
That's right.
what we know.
That's
Because
right.
everything else then becomes like literature.
Yeah. No, I agree with you 100%, but I have my tongue firmly planted in my cheek I'm trying to rile up people by calling it a history of the impossible, precisely because of what you just say, that, there are many things that were once thought impossible that aren't. And actually, I thought I was doing something novel, but I have found several other books with the impossible in the title used in a similar way, including this book by historian of religion at Rice University, Jeffrey Kripal, Kripal, Authors of the Impossible, which is about 19th and 20th century writers from all kinds of specialties who write about impossible things. But yeah, I agree with you. It's
Carlos,
yeah. Hi.
I'm Roberto González Echevarría, professor of literature here at Yale, now retired. But I'm here also as a member of the Yale Aviation Club because I'm a pilot, as is Taia Reinaga here, who's also a member of the Yale Aviation Club. We laugh because isn't there something humorous in this business of flying nuns?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, certainly there is. And, most of the flying nuns end up being processed by the Inquisition and discovered to be frauds. So the issue is, why are some deemed legitimate and some not legitimate? Why are their tricks discovered and why are other people's tricks not discovered? We actually had a very interesting discussion in one of my classes yesterday. It's a course, History of the Supernatural. And we were dealing with 19th century spiritualists, seances and so on.
Mesmerism, right?
And mesmerism and theosophy. But anyway, the image you saw of Daniel Douglas Hume, he is the one spiritualist medium that no scientist could crack, discover or prove that he had some trickery involved in his things. So that's what keeps me flying. But you know, St. Joseph is your patron saint, or anyone who flies. It's the patron saint of all flyers. Ironically, a job given to him by American bomber pilots who were bombing the hell out of Italy during the Second World War, who proposed, hey, here's a good patron saint for all flyers.
If I may follow up on the earlier question, you know, it is true that all knowledge is provisional and that what we know, even in science, is best to date and is apt to get refined, changed, altered. But do you think that when these visualizations and these claims were made, people were not really looking for an explanation? Although I noticed that you noted that anytime you had someone levitating, there was a witness. There was another person in the frame who could
Right.
testify that this.
Right.
So there's sort of this nod to evidence, but at the same time, when you look at those images, at least at the time, they were not meant to be challenged.
That's right.
Right?
No, they're not
no
meant
cause
to be.
was sought.
No. And as a matter of fact, the Protestants too are looking for causality. There's always a search for causality. But why does Cotton Mather insist that these burly men sign an affidavit? You know, say, yes, I was there and I tried to hold her down. It's because they know there are challenges. And I think that many of those paintings actually were commissioned because those commissioning them knew that this was not believed by 100% of the people anywhere, that there was skepticism. And I found, not in regards to levitation, but another miracle attributed to St. Teresa, her corpse refused to decompose. And in one of her hagiographies, the hagiographer says, you don't want to believe? Go ahead, don't believe. But if you don't believe this, you shouldn't believe any of the miracles in the Bible either, which is, I don't know if that's a good argument.
Any other questions?
If I can add, and again, my background is experimental biology.
Uh-huh.
It was absolutely, I would call it, materialist, like in the bad meaning of this word. And then my son sent me an article from a paper from Lancet. And Lancet, it's a bona fide, medical
Right.
journal. And it described the case of a person who was, hit by a truck or something like this, brought in an emergency room, intubated. So he was what they call flatlined,
Right.
in America, right? And then, after that, he was rescued, obviously, and he was in his room. And when the nurse came, he said, oh, this is she is. She took my dentures. So he could describe that she took the dentures and put in a certain drawer,
Mm-hmm.
right, while he was flatlined. And the paper presented as one of many cases and discusses others. And as an experimental biologist, I had to take it as a fact. Because, from what you say, wild fact, not fact, I think it should be distinction between facts, which is something verifiable,
Right.
and opinions, right? Somebody can have an opinion that somebody is flying, but a fact is a fact. So the thing is, and it turns out there's a department called perceptual studies in the University of Virginia
Yes.
that, follow the work of William James. And
Right.
multiple things are documented. Obviously, there's a lot of fraudsters and everywhere, but in science, as we know it and accept, there are also very fraudsters. But this is something that is verifiable and unexplainable.
That's right.
It's a modern miracle, you can call it, right?
Yep.
But it's undeniable because it's documented, published in Lancet and everything. So maybe this is what I am looking forward to read your book. Maybe I'm just repeating what.
Thanks. Well, I'm glad you brought up this parallel because, these impossible things are on a spectrum, I like to think. And near-death experiences, which is what, the subject category under which this research falls, is part of the spectrum, because there's something undeniable about it, but there's vehement disagreement among scientists and medical personnel who study this phenomenon. And I just spent the past 3 days reading some of this back and forth. And I was stunned to discover that there is a Journal of Near-Death Experiences, which was run out of University of Virginia, and the Center for, what was the title of the? Yeah, Perceptual Studies, yeah. And ironically, I spent 15 years at the University of Virginia and didn't know this center was there. I had to come here 27 years later, find out, oh, they were next door. But yeah, I appreciate what you're saying very much.
But I guess the question is, there are many such things in neuroscience as well, right? There are phantom arms, people feel pain and phantom arms and so on. And the question is, I'm not sure miracle is the word. I think mystery might be a better word for something like that, because miracle is loaded.
Feel something before about the near-death experiences. I thought, well, if you're drunk, I mean, I didn't experience myself to this extent, but alcoholics see small green animals running around, right? And people can see many things, but if you can verify what the person said,
And replicate.
verify, I just say,
And
it
replicate.
says it was there, and it is, and there's no way he could see it. You have to stop and say, look, we don't know how we work, we don't know how the brain works, something fundamental. And maybe
Yeah.
this stuff comes out in there.
There are numerous puzzling wild facts of this sort that go into the 20th century. You might recall I refused to call Maria de Agreda the greatest bilocator of all time. The reason for this is that just at the end of my research, it was too late for me to include this in the book, and it was the wrong century. I discovered that in the 20th century, there was a French nun who bilocated more frequently and even more outrageously than Maria de Agreda. And at the very same time, rescued French resistance fighters and downed Allied pilots by dressing them as nuns and escorting them out of the hands of the Nazis. But most of her levitations were to prisons and concentration camps. And some of the testimonies are from individuals who claim she came, comforted them, or, in some cases, helped them escape. And for some odd I can't figure this out, because she died in 1951, and there's a lot of French language literature on her. There's nothing in English, nothing in German, nothing in Spanish, nothing in any language other than French. She's not known outside of France. You can find her on YouTube, however, but that's always a dicey proposition. But yeah, there are these puzzling things. I also found somebody, again, emailed me this, something that happened during the 1970s that I was totally unaware of, which was an apparition of the Virgin Mary in the 1970s, of all places, a suburb of Cairo, Zaytun, which was viewed by over 1 million people over a period of 2 years every night, and was in all the Egyptian newspapers, of course, but never made it to any newspaper I read in the 1970s. And most of the viewers were Muslims, not Christians. So I love these wild facts that just throw you for a loop and leave you wondering how it is that, well, one way to put it, with small brackets, how belief is constructed, or how belief is reported. Those two things have a lot to do with people's exposure to these kinds of phenomena.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was wonderful. You talked about how people are reporting. The people who wrote these stories 500 years ago, or even our sacred stories, had a whole different vision and understanding of the cosmos than we do today.
Yes.
And yet, this is particularly true of our theologians, we still go back and interpreted them based on their interpretation of the cosmos. Mm-hmm. They wrote it from that, and we look at it and say, well, this is how it was, even though they had this whole different vision of it. I also just wanted to say your story about Mary. Mary is one of the most revered women in Islam. She's one of the only women mentioned in the Quran. So it's not surprising at all that in Egypt it would be a lot of Muslim women that were there. It's not, people sometimes are shocked by that, but it's not a surprise. But the whole idea of how do we reimagine our science and our theology, not based on what they wrote 2,000 years, and not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, to use that old Irish expression, to take that wonderful work, but understand it from how we understand the cosmos today.
Right. And no, I agree with you that's a real challenge. However, the testimony is not all from clerics who are writing hagiographies. The canonization inquests they're almost like legal proceedings, and they ask for testimony from all different sorts of people. I'm sorry? Oh, yes.
Interlocutors
Right.
that are rooted in faith.
Right. And this scholar at Rice University I mentioned, Jeffrey Kripal, he has argued that belief as a social phenomenon, as a social fact, has a lot to do with the occurrence of these impossible events and impossible phenomena. That there's a correlation between the belief and the events. Although there's no easy way to explain it scientifically, unless one has discovered proof of, interpenetrating dimensions, which has yet to be accomplished. But I think my Welsh scientist was very, very excited by the suspension of time-space, something I cannot understand, and I don't know how widely believed he will be in his own scientific community.
We close with one final question.
Some of the narrative details of the depictions. For instance, the crowd is pretty reverential.
Oh, yeah.
Well, and I'm thinking if someone levitated in front of me, if I didn't know them, I might be scared that I was going to levitate too, or that they were going to fall on me. If it was my friend Nancy, I would be holding on to her so that she didn't float away. But there seems like a standard in these the pictures that this is how you treat a levitation.
That's the depiction.
Yes.
The actual accounts are very different. People are frightened half to death, often, in the description of the accounts. They're frightened half to death. And terror is one of the words used. Or, the equivalent of the English word terror. The funny thing is that, I don't know if you know of the illusionist David Blaine. Yeah. David Blaine, there was a documentary on David Blaine years ago, like at least 2 decades ago, where he was performing tricks on the street in Manhattan. And one of his tricks was levitation, which has all to do with how you place your feet. And the camera in this documentary was always aimed at his feet, very rarely at his whole body. But You could see that from a certain perspective, it looked like his feet were off the ground. But what I liked is that the camera also turned to the audience. And at least the clips they chose for the documentary, everyone is backing away from him. The body language is constant in all those clips. Everybody's going. And then there's an image of a young woman saying, "Oh, he must be very holy." Yeah, if I saw somebody levitating, I think I would maybe run out of the room. Not just back away, but scary stuff sometimes. I did fail to mention that every time Joseph of Cupertino went up, he let out some sound, loud sound. And the Italian words are grido, shout, strillo, or screech, and urlo, some kind of basso profundo detonation of sorts, which one time, according to several testimonies, made the walls of the monastery shake, and the monks run out of their cells yelling, "Earthquake! Earthquake!" That's scary too. Did it happen? Well, nobody will be able to prove it. We don't have film. But I just received an email yesterday from some TV program that claims they have film of people levitating, and they want me to comment. And I said, I don't know of any films of, people levitating. Sure, sign me up. I want to see these.
Carlos, this wonderful presentation reminded me of the miracle of Lanciano and other Eucharistic miracles. So the heart of every Catholic Mass is the consecration, as you mentioned. So it's, suppose you could term it a quotidian kind of miracle, right? It's oft repeated every Mass, every day, every hour, everywhere in the world. There are, like the miracle of Lanciano, explicitly rendered hosts, Eucharists, right, that bleed and are still preserved thusly. You mentioned Luther and how he believed in the true presence, but subsequent Protestants, and obviously Protestantism in general, strayed from that. Could you walk us through a bit how we went from Luther believing in the presence to his contemporaries, let's say, and soon thereafter?
Yeah, sure. It's at the critical turning point in the history of the Protestant Reformation, is that Luther continued to believe in the real presence, but he didn't like the term transubstantiation or the concept of transubstantiation because it required you to be an Aristotelian and understand what was meant by substance and accident. And also because there's no description of what happens in Jesus' word. So he was being very biblical about it. But he insisted, if Jesus says, take this and eat, this is my body, right? That was the bottom line for him. So in 1529, he and all the other major reformers of that period meet in one room at Marburg in Germany. They have been brought together by Philip of Hesse, the most powerful Lutheran prince of the time, so that they can form a military alliance among all the different branches of Protestantism, including those Swiss who fight so well. They agree on 13 points. They cannot agree on 14, the Eucharist. And Luther actually writes on the table, we have notes that were taken by 4 different people. So we have 4 different transcripts. They all say, Luther wrote on the table with chalk, hoc est corpus meum, in Latin. This is my body. And then he put a little cloth over it. And every time the Swiss, especially, who didn't believe in the real presence, brought up, but could be a metaphor. Jesus also said, I am the vine, you are the branches. He's being metaphorical. Luther would say, no, it's not a metaphor. No. And then he'd lift up the little cloth and point to the word est. Est. Est means est. It kind of reminded me of the Bill Clinton affair years ago. What is something? The semantics got involved. But Luther finally they started insulting each other at Marburg. And Luther at one point says, and you'll have to pardon my German, look, Christ not only said, this is my body. He says, take this and eat. He says, if God had commanded me to eat Scheisse, I would have to. So it's the word of God. God can do anything. So the Swiss come back at him and say, look, Jesus has a human body. His resurrected body was fully human, and it went up to heaven. A human body cannot be in two places at once. Luther responds, you're being too mathematical. God is all-powerful. God can be everywhere if he wants to. And the discussion goes on and on and on and on. They can't agree, and no military alliance. So that's how it diverged. And in the Anglican Church, the definition of the Eucharist is unclear enough to suggest both symbol and presence, at least the 1549 Book of Common Prayer. So there are these differences.
Thank you so
Great.
much once again. So let's all thank Carlos for fantastic.
Thank you.
talk.
Thank you all. Thank you.